Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. They are Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso, my teammates over at Lions247.com. We've got a lot to come your way here on this episode of the podcast. Last time around, we broke down much of what we heard and witnessed at the Beaver Stadium media room during Matt Campbell's introductory press conference that was on Monday. We also spent a lot of time breaking down what Campbell accomplished in Ames during his run at Iowa State that spanned a decade. We had Alec Bussey, who covers the Cyclones as an insider within our 24/7 Sports Network. He spent a considerable amount of time for us going through the highs, a lot of highs, and a few of the lows that were experienced during his 10 seasons as the head coach of those Cyclones. I encourage you to check that out. We're going to break down things as the ball continues to move forward here in State College from a recruiting standpoint, from a roster standpoint, from a coaching staff standpoint. No one better to help us get done all that needs to get done on this episode than Daniel Gallen and Tyler Calvaruso. And guys, we have a lot to get to. I think we can probably get going with the coaching staff moves because this is the next shoe to drop. Whenever you hire the head coach, you're curious, okay, well, who's going to be with him still? Who's moving on to the next phase of their career? And before we get to some of the guys who have been added to the staff, mostly following him from Iowa State, Daniel, let's discuss who are some of those names that we've gotten to know a bit over the years or over this season at least here in State College who are heading elsewhere for 2026. You can go wherever you'd like. I know we got a few names to address.
Well, we can start with who's going to Blacksburg because I think that's the most interesting thing for Penn State fans. James Franklin seems like he's getting the band back together to a certain extent. The news about Brent Pry being his defensive coordinator broke last weekend. But in terms of people who were on the 2025 Penn State staff, we've got reporting that Ty Howell, who was co-offensive coordinator and tight ends coach at Penn State, and quarterbacks coach Danny O'Brien, along with Chuck Losey, that strength coach and a real key, I think, member of the entire operation. They're all going to be Hokies next year. They're reuniting with Franklin at a new spot. I think that it's going to be interesting to see how different things look. The reporting is that Howell is going to be the play caller down there, which we saw a little bit of that late in 2023. I think he's someone who is really well regarded in the industry, potential rising star type of guy. So I'm interested to see what he can do in that position. And then two of the other departures who spent 1 year at Penn State moved on. Stan Drayton to South Carolina, Jim Knowles to Tennessee. I know that there is some conversation, some speculation that maybe Penn State decides to pair their incoming head coach with Jim Knowles. Maybe they decide to keep him around. He was on that enormous for a coordinator 3-year contract. There's reporting from ESPN that there's a negotiated buyout from the $7 million that Penn State still had left on that. So yeah, I think those are the names right now. I don't know if anyone else has popped up.
Did we get the Danny O'Brien in that?
Yeah, he was in there.
Yeah, because it got bunched up a bit with me for Ty Howell because that one is, to me, those have kind of been James's guys. I mean, I know that they're considered, obviously guys who have history at different Big Ten campuses. Danny O'Brien, Maryland when it was in the ACC, and then briefly at Wisconsin, right? But to me, James has kind of really vouched for him every step of the way. He's the guy who you wrote a story on it, was basically projecting him as a rising star in this industry. And that's before he was even the full-time, full-fledged quarterbacks coach here at Penn State. And then Ty Howell is one where his history here at Penn State predates James Franklin. He was a team captain when shit went down and at the turn of the last decade, and he was an important piece of that moment for the program. And then he went and he really made his mark at lower levels, rising up the ladder in the college football coaching industry. Franklin brings him on initially as a guy who's kind of helping in the background. You see Tyler Bowen take off and join Urban Meyer's staff with the Jacksonville Jaguars several years ago. Ty Howell ends up being that internal promotion before we saw Deion Barnes get that internal promotion as the alum who had been around, doing a lot of the dirty work as an assistant. Ty Howell was that guy who got the opportunity to do that tight end. We know that things kept going really well at tight end under his watch. And so, Daniel, I think these are another two examples in terms of those two guys who are following James to Virginia Tech that, again, you're putting a list together 2 months ago. Who were some of those names near the top? Probably Ty Howell and Danny O'Brien.
Definitely. And I think Hal too had really picked up the reputation as a good recruiter,
Mhm.
someone who was really valuable in I think some key areas in the Penn State footprint. He struck me as someone who was, younger, pretty engaging, all those different things. But yeah, I mean, you talk about, guys that we were, penciling in to be, the Franklin guys that are moving on. O'Brien was obviously firmly in that camp. I think he's someone that is a little bit difficult to evaluate the job that he did here. I think that because it's so tied into Drew Aller, which I think for a lot of people didn't reach expectations. But then you have all the different factors of, you know, the Andy Kotelnicki offense, all those different sorts of things, coming together. And O'Brien also, this was his first, real college coaching job. He was working in the CFL for a little while after his career ended there, but came over to Penn State, and this is the only place that he's worked in college football.
So James Franklin's going to have a lot of familiarity with the guys who are in key roles as Brent Pry returns as his defensive coordinator there. Very unique storyline in Blacksburg. And then, of course, Ty Howell, as Daniel referenced, the reporting has indicated he's going to be play caller on offense, which we have seen in an interim level here at Penn State, but not the full-on job. And so if he gets that, James Franklin's working with a couple coordinators that he has a lot of history with. And from a recruiting standpoint, Tyler, when we talk about those guys going down to Virginia Tech, it's difficult for me to ignore not just what Ty Howell was doing with that tight end pipeline, and it's been well documented of when they're losing guys to the NFL, there always seems to be someone stepping up next. Maybe we didn't see it to the extent we thought we would this year in terms of production, but there's clearly talent in that room, even when Khalil Dinkins moves on with his career after his senior season. But how important was Ty Howell beyond the tight end room, Tyler, when you talk about his impact in that Mid-Atlantic region? I know people point to the DMV area. He was a point man for a lot of what they wanted to accomplish down in that part of their recruiting footprint.
Yeah, he was integral in the DMV recruiting effort. So I think that's where you're going to feel his loss on the recruiting trail the most. And obviously, with this position, did a really good job of selling top tight ends on Penn State. There was a point really towards the end of Ty Howell's tenure with the Nittany Lions where Penn State was going out and getting, I don't want to say pretty much any tight end that it wanted, because that's obviously not the case, but they were in it with pretty much all of the top ranked tight end recruits in the nation at one point in time. Some of those recruitments, Penn State stayed strong. Some of those recruitments, things tailed off. But the fact of the matter is, Ty Howell had Penn State in those battles, and I think there's something to be said for that at the end of the day. So impactful recruiter, young guy, connected with kids well. So he was good on the trail. He was good with the guys in the room when they got to Penn State, as we've seen on the player development front. Like you said, not necessarily what it was all cracked up to be this year, but it's been a down year across the board. So I think Hal, in hindsight, I think he's in a good spot. Virginia Tech, I think he's going to go on to have some pretty decent level of success in his coaching career. I think Penn State will miss him on the trail.
Well, that's a spot that you'd like to think that no matter who is taking that over, and we'll talk about some of the influx of coaches in a moment, that it's still a position that, because of the brand here at Penn State, will be able to recruit itself in some key ways. We've long said that about running back, but man, I don't know what they have down the road here at running back. And by down the road, I mean when they put the pads on next March and get back on the practice field. I'm not sure what that's going to look like. We've talked about it all season long, how beyond the record-setting performances for Kaytron Allen and Nick Singleton, guys who have done it a long time together, and now seniors, we don't know what's cooking in that running back room. We did not see a scholarship running back get involved on offense at all during 9 Big Ten games. And maybe that changes in the bowl game. We'll tell you why a little bit more in that regard. But with Stan Drayton kind of here and gone, he was head coach at Temple. Now he's going to be off to the SEC, where he's been before as a position coach. He'll be down in South Carolina. Daniel, you talked about that. I don't know really how to evaluate Stan Drayton with the Nittany Lions. Kaytron Allen had the best year of his career. A lot of people were kind of indicating that was the anticipation, though, because it was his first really full, healthy offseason of the year. Nick Singleton had some of his most epic struggles of what was a really productive year for much of this season. He was able to really generate some momentum during the month of November, but overall it was a bit of a slog for Singleton. And when it comes to the 5 other guys who were on scholarship, Quentin Martin, Corey Smith, Cam Wallace, Tyke Hayes, Jabri Coleman, I don't know how many are going to be part of the 2026 plan, first off, and it's hard for us to tell exactly what those guys were able to accomplish during their first college season or second college season.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, really hard to grade what Stan Drayton did in that running back room. I do think that Katron Allen, like you put that in that meeting in that interview with Shane Beamer at South Carolina, like you put that at the top of the list. And then, I think that with the rest of it, it's I think really, really tough to get a handle on. I mean, I think that the things that James Franklin and Stan Drayton were saying in August about all the young guys in that room not being ready to step up. I mean, I think that was something that we all sort of assumed would take care of itself, just given the history that we've seen in that room. But it's very clear that it didn't. I mean, we joke about RB3 being probably the storyline from August that had the least amount of bearing on the 2025 season. And yeah, I mean, you do wonder, what is next for those guys? I mean, I was putting something together when the Drayton news was breaking, and like Quentin Martin didn't play an offensive snap this year. Like he was on kick coverage. Like that's pretty crazy to think about when you consider the fanfare and how we saw touches manufactured for him during his true freshman season when he redshirted. So, I think that and also Stan Drayton, it's hard to ignore the shadow of Jaywan Sider, who is out in South Bend and has a Heisman Trophy finalist in Jeremiah Love. Now, I mean, I think that we saw what Jeremiah Love was last year, but before Jaywan Sider got there. But I think that also affects how you look at what Drayton did, given what Jaywan accomplished at Penn State, and then what he was able to do with Love and Jadarian Price out in South Bend. So I think that's one that who knows if we'll ever really find out the dynamics, like ever really get to the bottom of what was going on. But I think that the running back room this year, outside of Katron Allen, you just kind of look at and throw your hands up a little bit.
And the things we heard publicly on the record from Drayton about the running back room beyond Katron Allen and Nick Singleton, they were not glowing. And they indicated a coach who was still trying to find a third talent that he could count on in a game, and just never developed in that direction. Whether you want to credit Singleton and Allen for not relinquishing any reps, or this team not racking up some blowouts in Big Ten play that maybe we thought they would. End of the day, these guys clearly weren't considered part of the game plan for throughout the season. And so that leaves us a lot to consider, a lot to try to figure out. And I don't know what we'll hear from any of these young players on their year with Drayton, because I don't know how many of these guys are going to be around for us to talk to in 2026, given the portal. When you talk about departures, look, there's some significant ones there on the offensive side of the football. But in terms of expectations versus reality and where things went in 2025 and where things are now finishing for Jim Knowles in 2025, which is Knoxville, Tennessee, he is heading to the SEC himself, one and done, like Stan Drayton here with the Nittany Lions. And like Stan Drayton, this was one that came with some fanfare. Drayton was a little bit deeper into the cycle. They had some known commodities at running back, but it was a pretty significant pickup that people paid attention to. But everyone across college football noticed when Jim Knowles was Penn State's pickup at defensive coordinator last winter, just days after he helped Ohio State win a national championship. He makes the move here within the Big Ten. Highest paid coordinator, documented in college football history at that point, over $3 million per year. We had him in an introductory press conference here in Happy Valley in late January, and he's talking about wanting to be that missing piece. Now everything here is so close to a national championship. And you look at the results, and obviously at 6-6, that tells a large part of the story. But defensively, guys, this is a group that had leads with less than 5 minutes to play in 4 of its 6 losses. It's also a group that gave up 34-plus points against Rutgers, UCLA, and Ohio State. And Ohio State over the years has been a team that they typically have kept to a lower point total. Rutgers and UCLA, bigger problems than that, certainly, than what they faced with the Buckeyes, as you kind of digest how those games turned out. But Daniel, there's no getting around this. This is the end for Jim Knowles in State College, so we can officially say it was not a successful tenure. I thought maybe we'd have a second year to evaluate, and we'd start to see those stepping stones that people kept telling us about. Hey, it takes a little while. And we had heard some optimism even a couple weeks ago that they felt like Jim Knowles in 2026 could have the defense in a good place. Instead, was it 4 consecutive years now with the new defensive coordinator? My math may be stretching it a bit, but I think it's 4 consecutive years here with a different defensive coordinator. And Jim Knowles takes his mastermind, slow-moving defensive strategy down to Knoxville and to Tennessee.
Yeah, I mean, I think up there with the RB3 storyline from August is definitely above it, would probably be like we're ready to win now. We can win now with this defensive system. Like we're not worried about the learning curve. Like the guys are gonna understand it. They're gonna get up to speed, which is what we heard from James Franklin, which is what we heard from Jim Knowles, which is what I think we heard from some of the players. And then it's October and you're out at UCLA, and you're hearing things about, well, guys like they don't completely grasp the system. Guys aren't completely where they need to be every single time out there. And then a couple weeks later, we're simplifying things for different guys. Like we're simplifying this defense to try to make it easier. I think that kind of paints the picture, that trajectory right there of how things went. I think that you go back to January, and I mean, this was a coup. This was an enormous deal. I think that for some people, you looked at it as not only what it could do to Penn State, but what it could do to Ohio State in terms of taking away their defensive coordinator and what that could mean for them. And then when they followed it up by hiring Matt Patricia, I think a lot of us, raised our eyebrows at that, maybe rolled our eyes. But that paid off very nicely for the Buckeyes, obviously. I mean, I think this Knowles tenure, I think where we're sitting now with the benefit of hindsight, it just feels like a very, very odd fit. Not from the personality wise, which is, we've heard that Knowles is just, a different kind of guy, just from the fact that it was all in for 2025. This was a win now. And you hired someone who at Oklahoma State and at Ohio State, this is going to be a progression. It might take a couple years, before it really gets going. But once it does, it's going to be great. James Franklin didn't have that luxury. A lot of these players didn't have that luxury. And I think that, when you evaluate this season, that decision, while I do think there was a chance that it could have worked, I think it was just short-sighted and just a bad timing more than anything in terms of the timelines that everyone was operating on.
It helped Penn State win the offseason. I mean, in the Big Ten conversation, in the national conversation, you remember those winners and losers list of the offseason last year. Penn State was near the top of everybody's winners list, and a big part of that was they took a big piece of the puzzle away from Columbus. Lo and behold, Matt Patricia did a damn good job with that defense this year, and you can't really pin that loss against Indiana on Ohio State's defense in the Big Ten championship game. And by the way, how about the Hoosiers winning the Big Ten title, a team that Penn State pushed to the brink of an upset here about 5 weeks ago? But when we look at Jim Knowles, Tyler, I think a lot of us, it's easy to point to the underwhelming nature of the on-field results, I should say. They're middle of the pack in points allowed per game in the Big Ten. They're middle of the pack in generating pressure. They're middle of the pack and actually holding teams to yardage totals. There's nothing that they really did at an elite level. And you look at the 2 games late where it felt like they found their footing. Do you attribute that to Terry Smith telling us that he pushed for a simplification of this defense? Do you attribute it to they played a couple teams in Michigan State and in Nebraska who are on backup quarterbacks who hadn't played a bunch, and that's part of the process? Whatever that angle is, and whatever you want to poke holes for Jim Knowles, I think is fair. But what I'm curious is, what are the ramifications for roster building, in your opinion, here with Jim Knowles leaving the building? There were a few guys that sounded like they were beginning to feel more comfortable within his defensive scheme, maybe sounding optimistic about what they could accomplish in 2026. And then from a recruiting standpoint, Tyler, Jim has never struck me as the kind of dynamic presence that's going to win over a recruit and their family in the living room. But is this next turnover yet another offseason where you're going to a different defensive strategy? How does this complicate the process for recruiting?
From a roster retention standpoint, it's going to come down to scheme fit and what Penn State decides it wants to do under Matt Campbell. Because some of these guys are going to look at that and say, "Hey, am I a fit in this new system that they're going to be installing?" That's what it's going to come down to on the retention front. In the portal, you're going to recruit players who have a different skill set than you might have recruited under Jim Knowles. There's just going to be guys who may not have profiled as fits in the past. They'll be profiling as fits in this new Penn State defense. From a high school recruiting perspective, Jim Knowles, I'd say his biggest impact was really kind of just breaking down X's and O's with guys when they were on campus. Terry Wiggins, that was a big deal for him. He got with Jim Knowles, learned a lot about his potential fit in Penn State's defense with Knowles calling the shots. So that's where his biggest impact on the trail came. Penn State stopped sending its coordinators out on the road late in James Franklin's tenure as head coach. So Knowles, you're right. Knowles really was not that dynamic recruiting presence, so to speak. He still carried value in that realm, but it wasn't the young, energetic coordinator type that you see at some other programs. I mean, not even the young, energetic coordinator, recruiter type that you see now with Taylor Mauser, now that he's coming over from Iowa State. So definitely a different kind of cat on the recruiting trail. Still had his fair share of impact when guys were on campus, but beyond that, I think Jim Knowles is a known commodity as a recruiter.
I want to get to some things with you, Tyler, in a moment on the coordinator situation and what you mentioned for some new blood on the staff that follows Matt Campbell. But Daniel, can you talk us through the coordinator situation as Penn State now navigates, I guess, 2 weeks, just a bit over 2 weeks away from Game 13, taking on Clemson in the Bronx for the Pinstripe Bowl? We've already covered, the comings and goings. It feels a little bit probably like an airport terminal right now in the Lash building between everybody making their way out of town or coming into town. What do we need to know about the coordinator positions and where things stand right now? Because we haven't gotten to Andy Kotelnicki to this point in the show.
Yeah, I had that thought just a moment ago but I guess because he doesn't have that destination yet, it's a little, he can fall by the wayside, especially given the gravity of Virginia Tech right now. But Andy Kotelnicki, our Mark Brennan confirmed it yesterday, is going to stay on through the bowl game. I also just pulled up some of Stan Drayton's comments down at South Carolina. He is going to stay on through the bowl game before going down to Columbia. So that's two of your offensive players, I guess, that are offensive staffers. I made the note yesterday where it was Stan Drayton was still listed on the roster, and all the other guys who had left for Virginia Tech were off. So I guess that may be a little bit of a signal of who is going to be at Yankee Stadium when you get around to late December.
Daniel, Drayton gets to complete his quest and all of our collective quest to find out who RB3 is, because that's going to be at least RB2. We'll get to it in a moment. Nick Singleton is among those confirmed opt-outs. So he's got a couple weeks here to give us an answer maybe on who's the next man up at running back.
I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing 25 carries from Tyler Holsworth on a cold winter day at a baseball stadium. I think he was my blue-white game MVP pick a couple years ago, so I can make good on that in the Pinstripe Bowl. But yeah, so we'll see. Andy Kotelnicki is going to move on. It'll be interesting to see where he lands. I haven't seen anything concrete about where that could be. Haven't heard anything, but I think it makes sense for everyone involved. Matt Campbell is going to bring in Taylor Mauser from Iowa State with him. He's another Campbell lifer, been with him since he was at Toledo in 2015. He's 34 years old, a young talent in the industry. I think that, Tyler C can probably get a little bit more into this, but when the OC comes over, the head coach is coming over, you start thinking about the quarterback, what that could mean. But yeah, so Penn State has its offensive coordinator, and we'll see on defensive coordinator. I know that there is some reporting about John Heacock coming over from Iowa State, and what that could look like. Could it be as more of an analyst? There's expectation he could retire. That seems like it's something a little bit more up in the air. I haven't been on the Iowa State roster page yet to see if his profile is still up. That was a little bit of a flag with some of these other assistants who came over earlier in the week with their profiles coming down off the website. So we'll see. I think it's going to be really interesting from the scheme perspective, especially defensively. Given that you're in kind of an in-between stage where you had this Knowles scheme that didn't seem like it was a fit for a lot of guys. You don't necessarily know who your guys are going to be next year. So how is that going to fit together? I think one more note on Knowles from like the player retention standpoint. I think Amari Campbell is going to be interesting to watch in terms of where he goes. Because I'm kind of being glib here, but whenever we would talk to him, he seemed like the only guy who understood the defense. Every time
he was always like, yeah, it's not that hard, guys. And it's everyone else says it's the worst thing to figure out ever.
He got to campus in June or May or whenever it was. And every time we talked to him, he was just like, yeah, I get it. Why? Yeah, I get it. And he said after the Rutgers game that, in terms of coming back, he wanted to look at who the new defensive coordinator was. And, he didn't tie himself to Knowles, but he said that if Knowles came back, was retained, that it would, be something that, would make Penn State really inviting to return, because he wouldn't have to learn a new scheme, wouldn't have to, go through that whole rigmarole again for the second straight year. So he'll be an interesting one to watch.
You know what the irony in that is too? When I talked to Amari Campbell during the summer, he told me the first month he basically was like lost, just figuring things out. He took him a little bit, but once he figured it out and learned that system, I feel like he has it down like the back of his hand, which is kind of crazy given the narrative surrounding Jim Knowles' defense and how long it takes to get that really installed and rolling in the right direction.
It's a really interesting combo there that we're talking about at coordinator and with Mauser, who we'll get to in a moment, and then with John Heacock, who Daniel just laid out there. Is he retiring? Is he going to continue his career with Matt Campbell in more of an advisory analyst role at Penn State, or is he going to be the full-fledged defensive coordinator for the Nittany Lions? Still something that we're working on. And Heacock, as far as I understand it, was like in attendance at an Iowa State basketball event a couple of days ago. So he's still in Ames, the last we saw, and he is still on that Iowa State staff roster. Since you mentioned you hadn't looked maybe today yet, Daniel, I just did. And he is still showing up there underneath their new head coach, Jimmy Rogers, as the defensive coordinator. Heacock's the guy who was with Campbell throughout the time at Iowa State, like a lot of the different staffers we're going to be discussing here. He was also with Campbell out of Toledo, which was the job prior to Iowa State that Matt Campbell first really got himself on the radar as a head coach who could make it work. Mauser, on the other hand, and by the way, Heacock at this stage, 65 years old. Mauser, 34. He is 34. He's a 1991 birth date. And he's a guy that was at Toledo, but as a graduate assistant, just starting to really get involved in college football coaching, learning about that lifestyle. And at that point, he would have been only 24 years old. Since then, he has worked his way up the ladder under Matt Campbell. He came on with him at Iowa State, became a GA there as well. Then he was becoming a quality control assistant, tight ends coach, offensive coordinator, and now he is the offensive coordinator at Penn State. I guess we could technically call him the offensive coordinator in waiting, since Andy Kotelnicki still has a couple more weeks on the job. But Tyler, you referenced Mauser as that young, energetic presence. Outside of us stating the obvious, he's a guy who's born in 1991. That makes him more relational to some of the current players than guys going to be 60, 70 years old at this stage. What have you heard on Mauser, what he could bring to this coaching staff as a presence in the building, but really as an acquiring talent out of the transfer portal, out of the recruiting trail, because this is a team that's going to need an infusion of playmakers on offense?
Smart dude, charismatic, relates to his players well, kind of coach who gets his players to rally around just because he's such a likable presence. And he makes his system, from my understanding, easy to understand. He doesn't try to fit round pegs into square holes. He's going to play to Penn State's strengths on offense. I think that's the biggest thing with this group coming over from Iowa State. They're not going to try and force things that don't work. They're going to play not just to their strengths as play callers and coaches, but their personnel that they're inheriting here at Penn State. So it's not something where you're going to see an offense that is trying to make things work that they're just not working on a weekly basis. And I think that'll appeal to kids in the transfer portal, because they're going to go after guys who really fit the system that they want to run on multiple levels. Because if you look at Iowa State, you look at the way Iowa State succeeded offensively under Taylor Mauser's watch, playing to their strength on a weekly basis, dependent on matchup. Some things made sense on one week, didn't make sense in another week. Mauser was good at identifying that and rolling out an offense that was able to take advantage of an opposing defense's weakness. Recruiting feedback has been positive as well. Again, it comes down to the relatability and the charisma that Mauser brings to the table. You laid it out. He's a younger guy, relatable. Kids seem to like him. So it's a plus hire for Penn State, in my opinion. I know you should go on social media and you see some dialogue about, oh, he's not the big splashy name. But, hey, guess what? Sometimes the big splashy name doesn't really work out. Sometimes the boring name is the one that works out. And I think Taylor Mauser has a real chance to work out as a play caller with the Nittany Lions. I think that's a really good move bringing him over.
I don't think these are boring moves for Matt Campbell. I think these are moves that he views as proven commodities to him. They've made it work at Iowa State. And I think he's going to remind us when we get a chance to ask him. I think he'll probably bring it up often in year one. They made it work with a very limited resource pool. for themselves at Iowa State. And now all of a sudden you're getting your buddies double, triple salary raises to come work with you at a blue blood. You've got this money to work with. It's got to feel pretty special for a lot of them to continue this rapport, continue the continuity that they build in Ames, but being able to do it here at a school like Penn State and getting to do it with that kind of money to spend on the roster and making this kind of money themselves. Daniel, I know Mark has put together a tracker in terms of the staff and comings and goings. You've done a nice job producing stories for us every step of the way during that. In terms of additions to this coaching staff that we've noted thus far, I know we're waiting for some others to become official, but what stands out to you so far?
I mean, I think that you look at the Matt Campbell connections, that, who he's bringing with him, how long they've been together. I think how long, like the roots that some of these guys had at Iowa State. I know Deion Broomfield, he was the safeties coach at Iowa State last year. He played at Iowa State and was very successful there. I know we talked about Derek Hooser already, the general manager, but he essentially was working at Iowa State, I think, as a freshman, like her sophomore in college. Like he was there since 2011. Went up through the ranks. You look at Mauser's career path, like there's a unique background there in terms of the different departments that he worked in under Campbell before he graduated to that on-field position coach coordinator role. So I think that you've got guys that believe in Campbell, are familiar with him, and that Campbell believes in. That I think that we view this in terms of going from what Iowa State was in the Big 12 to what Penn State is in the Big 10 as, I think maybe a little bit of an increased degree of difficulty and just a different situation because of the different expectations, the different competition in the conference. And then also you're going to have different resources and you're going to be doing things. You're going to be able to do things in a different way than you did before. So I think that, it shows that Campbell believes that these are the guys that can, make that step, that can adjust to this new environment. And it's going to be, I think pretty curious. I think another thing too that stands out to me is the youth a little bit. Like Mauser's 34, Ryan Clanton, who's been reported as the offensive line coach. He was on that Oregon team in 2010 that played for the national championship. He was a team captain for Chip Kelly later in his career. That's someone who was, early to mid 30s. It feels like a different kind of, group, I think, coming in than what Penn State had here before.
Tyler, a name that Daniel mentioned along the way there was Derek Hooser. He's going to be the GM here. He is the GM here at Penn State now. We heard quite a bit on him from Alec Bussey, the Iowa State insider who joined us on our last episode of this podcast, because that was one of those names that had already surfaced as coming here to the staff. And we had heard confirmation from Matt Campbell, and he has had some really good things to say about him being one of the brighter minds in college football and how he was happy to have him again as he'd had him at Iowa State. What's the early verdict from you in terms of talking to people in the industry, maybe picking the brains of some Iowa State recruits over the last week or so? What have you learned about Derek Hooser and what he brings to the GM role? Because as we were discussing throughout this coaching search, that general manager spot was going to be integral, was going to have to work in tandem at times with the head coach. And here you've got two guys that are very familiar with each other, have a history together, and again, all of a sudden have a much bigger bankroll to work with together.
Really smart guy, well regarded by the recruits that I've gotten the chance to talk to, whether it be the former members of Iowa State signing class or 2027 recruits who were top targets for Iowa State. He's about his business. He's not going to BS you. If he thinks you could play, you can play, and he's not afraid to relay that to Matt Campbell and his staff. And that's why Iowa State was so good at making those shrewd early evaluations. Derek Hooser was at the forefront of that. He knows what he's looking at when he watches film. The same can be said about Jack Griffith, who Penn State just brought over as another key member of that personnel staff to work alongside Hooser. These guys know what they're looking at. They are grinders when it comes to evaluating. They're in the film room constantly breaking stuff down. That's why it's not just really early evaluations either. The player development aspect of it. They identify traits that tell you, hey, look, this kid's an intriguing high school prospect right now. He can work for us right now. But from a ceiling perspective, we could take things even further. Hooser is, I keep saying it, he was such a big reason why Iowa State was what it was from an early evaluation and player development standpoint. And I think Penn State is going to reap the benefits of that. He's a rising star in this industry. He is probably one of the best people to join, I think, Matt Campbell in State College, not just because of the rapport between the two, because of what he brings to the table in so many different ways. It's a guy Matt Campbell can trust, and he is going to be a crucial part of the operation here.
He's general manager. There's also familiarity with former Iowa State front office type Trent Slatnow, serving as director of player personnel. And you mentioned a name there that Daniel wrote a bit about on Thursday at Lions247.com, and Jack Griffith. He does not come from Iowa State. Mm-hmm. He's someone coming from an external source, and that's Cincinnati. He was director of player personnel over there. Going to be the assistant general manager here. It was first reported on Thursday by a couple guys that we work with in the CBS and 24/7 Sports Network, Chris Hummer and Matt Zenitz. And Daniel, you thought it was worth, doing a kind of a quick write-up on this one because the praise was strong about how he is viewed in the personnel industry across college football.
Yeah, I mean, definitely shout out to Chris Hummer and props to our colleagues over at Bearcat Journal for hopping in the thread with the news and, providing a little bit more context on who Jack Griffith is and, what he can bring and what he did at Cincinnati. He's a younger guy. He, I think, graduated from Marist University in 2020. He's an Akron native. He played college football at Marist. He was a safety. Has a little bit of a unique background. Like he worked for the school newspaper when he was there. He also, I think, founded a website about tracking stadiums that people go to and sharing their memories at different stadiums. And then, worked at Ohio State for a little bit, worked for the New York Jets for a little bit, and then found a home at Cincinnati where he'd been for the past couple of years. I think that there's a story on Bearcat Journal that referred to him as their portal czar. And he's responsible for IDing these different guys. And, I went through the list of, that Bearcat Journal put of some of their portal gets. And, it's a variety. Like there's a couple guys that, you might consider to be bounce back candidates coming down from higher levels. And then some of the other guys that they identified were, at lower levels. I think that one of the names they put was someone from Lindenwood that they found and was able to be a contributor. I mean, I think that they deserve some credit for IDing some talent in Brendan Sorsby because I was always a skeptic based on, one game watching him back in 2022 when Penn State went out to Bloomington and the Indiana offense was just miserable. And, for them to see something in him and then get it out of him at Cincinnati has really impressed me. So I think that, as we look at the changes as going from James Franklin to Matt Campbell, I think that Hooser and Griffith are probably at the forefront of, having this GM structure that I think is going to be a little bit different than what Andy Frank was with the GM title. And then building that out around him with an assistant GM, with someone who is so highly thought of in those ways. I assume that there's more to come. There's going to be some shuffling. I mean, we know how many support staffers that James Franklin had, and we know what the reported number is out there for the staff pool. So it's going to be interesting to see, how many more of these types of evaluation positions, maybe positions focused on player acquisition, end up being on this staff.
Tyler, one other name that we've been monitoring here, and it seems like he may be trending towards joining the staff and ultimately continuing his career as an assistant under Matt Campbell, is Iowa State receivers coach Noah Pauley. A lot of success at Iowa State. We talked about those two receivers that were drafted out of there, 1,000-yard receivers, and Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins, and now they're on the NFL rosters. But you look at what he's done throughout his career. You go back to his time at a lower level. I believe it was North Dakota State. Christian Watson was a player that did good things for him at the FCS level, and Watson has gone on to play for Daniel's Packers. And so, what would you make of this move? Because Daniel, if there's one spot where I think the average Penn State fan would say, where do they need to get better quickly in order to make this a successful tenure for the new head coach? Plenty of people would say, figure out what needs to be done at wide receiver, whether it's schematically, talent-wise. So this is going to be a focal point for whoever takes the job. If it's Paulie and he continues his career as Campbell's assistant, what is your interpretation of that move?
Would be a strong one. Another guy who's proven on the player development front. He's scored some pretty big recruiting wins, maybe not from a star perspective right off the bat. But again, I go back to the early identification stuff. Guys who have traits he knows he can coach up and get them to perform at a high level. I mean, the 1,000-yard wide receiver stat that has been floated out there a lot when discussing Paulie, I think that speaks volumes. I think his work in the portal, identifying receivers who can come in, pick up the scheme in a hurry, and produce, I think that's important. So overall, a couple different perspectives. I think it'd be a really strong wide receivers coach hire. I think he would fit nicely. He knows Campbell. He knows the staff dynamics, and that makes him an ideal fit in State College.
In the coming days, I would say early next week, as we get a little bit more settle from this new coaching staff, we'll have a bunch of feedback coming from Iowa State on a ton of these new assistants in the front office, on the coaching staff, working to speak with some people who are very close to the program out there, have followed the Cyclones for a while, and I hope to have that for you over at Lions247.com with some commentary on a bunch of these guys as we start to get these more locked in and have this staff filled out. We have a tracker over at Lions247.com. As names are added to the staff, as names are removed from the staff, it'll all be covered there over at Lions247.com. In terms of player movement, we have a few opt-outs that have occurred. I think we brought you one of them on the last episode, Zane Durant, senior defensive tackle. He will not play in the Pinstripe Bowl. Since then, safety Zacchaeus Wheatley taking the same approach. Can make a strong case that he was one of the most consistent Penn State players on either side of the ball from game 1 through game 12 this year. Very rarely left the field, was a true Iron Man defensively. I think he helped his draft stock over the course of his final year on campus. He is not going to be playing Clemson either later this month. And then the third name that surfaced on Thursday, Nick Singleton. More touchdowns than anybody scored in a Nittany Lions uniform. His touchdowns against Rutgers will prove to be his last, as Daniel, he has wrapped up his career as well. And the other thing to get to here is Elliott Washington will be entering the transfer portal when that opens up. We're going to start to see some movement in terms of Penn State players looking toward the portal. Washington's a guy who had a tremendous offseason last year, was a big-time talk on campus was largely on him during winter conditioning. That sustained for much of the summer into preseason camp. He was utilized as essentially the third perimeter cornerback for much of the season, may have taken a back seat of sorts to freshman Darius Dixon down the stretch, and so was maybe trending in the wrong direction in terms of cornerback usage, but someone who was highly regarded on special teams as well. Daniel, with all that in mind, what stands out to you from that mix of opt-outs and then the fact that Elliott Washington's going to be continuing his college career elsewhere in 2026?
Yeah, I think when you talk about the opt-outs, it's, I think understandable. I don't think any of us are surprised that, a running back isn't going to expose himself to another afternoon of hits in late December. The reporting from the Reading Eagle, which exclusively broke Nick Singleton's opt-out. Kind of cool to see that, give it to the local paper in this day and age, is that Singleton will be at the game. And will be with the team up in the Bronx, which, I think that doesn't surprise us when you talk about who Nick Singleton is and how he handled himself. Wheatley, I think he's up there with Campbell in terms of Amari Campbell, in terms of the most consistent performers on that defense last year. I think he's a really neat story in terms of development and, the non-linear paths that these guys can take. He got benched after that in that Indiana game in 2023 after he got burned early on and didn't really play much the rest of the year. And then feedback we got that winter and that spring was that he had really, changed his attitude and turned things around. I think that James Franklin said the light had come on for him. And then this year we got the feedback from Poindexter, Losi, and Franklin that, they had a meeting with Wheatley that was, pretty much like, what's it going to be? Like, what do you want to do? And Wheatley responded well to it. So I think that, it's worth remembering that even if a guy gets into his third year and, maybe you haven't seen it click, that, there's still a chance that it could, and it might, and that these guys are all working on different timelines, and that, maybe don't write someone off. And, I think that too, we're probably going to see fewer of those guys given the way that the portal is, given the way that things are. I know that Zachy Wheatley's dad was, talking about the opportunities that he might have had to leave at different points and what could have been awaiting him at those new locations. And, he stuck around. One thing with Washington is that it's another one of those things where I think we always put the asterisk on the offseason that this is just a piece of the puzzle. I think we do a good job of emphasizing that. And yeah, I mean, I think that showed up that there's a lot more to this than being the top tier athlete. My favorite thing about Washington was I think Chuck Losey referred to him as like a high horsepower athlete, which is to me like that's just a funny term to use when talking about a person. And how they go about things. But yeah, I mean, he had his signature moment where he, returned that block field goal for the touchdown against Iowa. Very valuable on special teams. Like he and Aldavian Collins on the punt team were really flying down there. And I think that he's someone where it's going to be interesting to see where he lands. But I think it's kind of it is a loss for a team when you lose that kind of athlete, someone with that kind of experience. I know that there's a sentiment that, kind of like, oh yeah, he's just being processed. Like, let's move on. Like that sort of thing. I've seen that on our board. I've seen it on social media, and it's like, it takes all kinds to, put a football team together. And, losing this sort of talent, former top 24/7 recruit, someone who had distinct roles on this team, it's another hole that a new staff is going to have to fill. And it's going to be interesting to see, how you go about that.
Yeah, there may be some guys on this team, I'm sure there are, that the next coaching staff's going to have some, difficult conversations with and maybe do that processing, however you want to phrase it. Elliot Washington is not one of those type of guys. And we're not sure what that cornerback room looks like. Davian Collins and AJ Harris both have junior eligibility right now, that they could have another season here at Penn State. They could have another season at the college football level. Will they take that opportunity? And if they do, will it be here in State College? Darius Dixon's a guy who made a big jump coming here from Southern California. It's worked out really well for him, I think, lately. He got to play a lot. He burned his red shirt. He's a true freshman. Is he going to decide to stick this through and really invest his college career here? And then Zion Tracy is playing that slot position, starting there. He's also a guy that has junior eligibility. So a lot to figure out at cornerback. What we do know is that Elliot Washington is going to explore his options. And I wanted to get to the conversation of roster retention with both of you before we start to wrap this up with some recruiting conversation. But guys, when you look at how things stand right now, you could point to someone approaching 1 year of eligibility left. You could point to someone who's only a freshman at this stage. But Tyler, who are 3 priority names for you when you look at this Penn State team and think about who could really help them by sticking around in 2026? You're muted. You're still muted. Now, can we hear you now?
Yeah, Google Chrome just failed me. Like, I don't know. I went on the board for 1 second. I couldn't get back to the window. I had to mute myself because my dog was barking. Anyway, I'm going to roll with 3 young guys because I think from a building block perspective, they're huge. Start wide receiver, Kobe Howard. And I know that, 2026 impact-wise, these are still young players who need to come on. But as upperclassmen, I think they could be integral pieces for this Penn State program. Kobe Howard, we've seen what he can do in flashes this year. He's a playmaker. You get him the ball, he can make guys miss, get in the second level, he can win over the top. He is the kind of dynamic presence that Penn State needs, quite frankly, at wide receiver moving forward. We talk about it constantly. Get more dynamic in the passing game. Get more explosive at wide receiver. You've got a guy already inside of Lash who is that player in Kobe Howard. So he's important to me. Yvonne Kamaju on the defensive line. I think he's got the whole world ahead of him on the defense. I really think he has that kind of ceiling. He's a freak athlete at his size, strong kid. I mean, just look at the work that he put in the weight room in one collegiate offseason. The kid's ceiling is as high as any young defensive player on Penn State's roster. I feel very confident in saying that. I think whether the next defensive line coach is Deion Barnes or someone else that Matt Campbell brings in, I think there's going to be a lot for that coach to tap into. And if it's Barnes, who's wound up being retained as the defensive line coach, that's a guy Kamaju's already familiar with. Regardless of who Kamaju's position coach is moving forward, he is going to be a very important player for Penn State to keep around. And then in the secondary, I roll with Darius Dixon. And this is where I think keeping Terry Smith around is paramount, because I said it time and time again during the recruiting process, Terry Smith made this one happen. He was at the forefront of it from start to finish. Penn State going out and getting kids from California at a program like Modern Day, it's not easy. I know Penn State, it's easier for them to recruit nationally more now than it ever has been, but it is still not easy. And going out and getting Darius Dixon was a huge recruiting coup right off the bat. We knew that right away. But what he has accomplished developmentally in year one working with Smith, he's another one of those guys you sit back and wonder, well, this is what he did in year one working with his position coach. Smith is going to be back on this staff next year in a final role that is still to be determined, but the guy who mentored him in year one is still going to be part of the program. And I think that's huge for Darius Dixon, because the fact of the matter is we all know how the portal works. We all know how back channeling works. I'm sure there's a ton of agent contact for a guy like Darius Dixon from high-level West Coast programs. That's just the way this world works. But Penn State has an in to keep Darius Dixon around. I think just holding on to him as one of those key young cornerback pieces, crucial.
I can't argue with any of those three. People might say, well, you went Yvonne Kamaju over Chaz Coleman. That's interesting. But I can't argue with any of those three picks. Daniel, who are the three names that stand out to you for roster retention?
Yeah, I'll look at the older guys because Tyler did a good job of covering those younger guys. I already talked about Amari Campbell. I think that he's someone interesting to look at. So three guys after that, I talk about King Mack. Veteran guy in the secondary. I think he played well down the stretch. He brings you that speed. He really came on as a playmaker. In that final month when he had the interception against Indiana. He was getting into the backfield a lot on blitzes. He has a good personality, and he has, I think, some leadership ability that I think can help when you talk about transitioning, from the Franklin era to a new era. Guys who might need to learn to lay the land a little bit. All those certain things. I think at tight end, Andrew Rapplier, he stands out to me. I think that you can talk about any of the guys with eligibility left in that room. Luke Reynolds, former 5-star, but I think Rapplier brings you that edge. Taylor Mauser has a really good track record working with tight ends. I think that could be an interesting marriage if Rapplier can stick around. He came on really nicely over the course of the year. I think once he shook off that rust from the injury. And then the last guy who I know that is a Virginia guy, a big Franklin guy, Anthony Donka. I think you look at this offensive line, and even if James Franklin was coming back next year, it was going to be a huge overhaul, just in terms of guys with expiring eligibility and the assumption that Venga Ioane is going to go on to the NFL and be a high draft pick. You're going to have to replace a ton of guys, a ton of experience there. I think Donka of that group, he's got the most starting experience. I liked what he did over the course of the year. Who knows what a new offensive line coach would think about the tackle guard thing with him, where his better long-term home is. Phil Troutwine made it clear where he thinks that is. But I think when you talk about, building up and the toughest places to build up, I mean, it's the trenches. Like, you cannot be weak in the trenches, no matter where you play, like, especially in the Big Ten. And so I think if you could retain like an Anthony Donka, maybe you throw Cooper Cousins in there as two notable guys up front. I think that is where you would start. And, with those guys, I feel like, they're the veterans. It feels maybe a little bit easier to see them moving on than maybe some of the freshmen, things like that. But I think that just from where I stand in terms of older guys who can help in a variety of ways beyond just on field, those stand out to me.
When we first sat down here, I had three names written down that have been covered already: Anthony Donko, Andrew Rapplier, and Darius Dixon. So you guys are on the money. I think you're doing great with this experiment. I can come up with a few more, though. I think whether or not he is going to be QB1 game one next year, I don't think that needs to be promised right now. But I know that outside of Terry Smith, the guy in the Blash building right now who may be your best glue for this roster and may be able to kind of help unify things as you try to get through what is going to be a turbulent couple of months here, reorganizing the structure of this program, is Ethan Grunkemeyer at quarterback. I'm fully acknowledging that if Rocco Beck says, hey, coach, I want to be with you, I don't think Matt Campbell's going to shut the door on him to continue their time together as QB and coach. They did that for 3 seasons at Iowa State, had a lot of success with it. But I think that Ethan Grunkemeyer, it's a major benefit to have him here beyond this trip to the Bronx for the Pinstripe Bowl, based on what we've gathered about his quick rise in the locker room, considering what we've seen with how he has gotten a longer leash in game action, how he's utilized that longer leash and the way the pass game has kind of evolved. I think there's a lot to like about what he's put on the field and off the field so far. And I think quarterback is such a vital spot. You look at what else is around him in that room right now. Jackson Smolik has a track record of injuries, has a track record of nothing in games. We view Beckham Kritza as a project. We view incoming freshman Peyton Falzone as a project. Drew Aller's moving on. And so even if Ethan Grunkemeyer isn't your starter going into next preseason camp or coming out of next preseason camp, boy, I think you'd like to have him as a factor in that quarterback room. The second name I'll go to, since we didn't hit on it through first 7, is Chaz Coleman. I think when you took the lay of the land earlier, Tyler, you got a lot of the names right. I think Kamaju showed a lot about what he can be, already really is as a well-balanced defensive end. I think right now, though, Chaz Coleman's upside is at a different level than anybody else on this roster in terms of a pass rusher, as an edge rusher, what he can do to the game, what can he affect in the game on a 3rd and long situation, on an obvious passing down. And then you build off that and you build on his traits. Remember, he got to campus in the summer, and we heard all that great stuff about him during preseason camp. What can it look like if you give him a full year ahead? If that's Deion Barnes still in that position room as the coach, and you have that continuity there, I think there's a lot to be gained for where Chaz Coleman could be from this point to next August, next September. The third name I'll go to, and I know that some people were kind of riled up about him last week because some of the stuff he put out there publicly, but you mentioned Amari Campbell, Daniel. That's an obvious one to me. His partner for much of the season, for the first half of the season, they did a lot of good things together, was Tony Rojas. These guys have a lot of history together, a personal connection. Now they have a connection here on the football field. And I think that just as you're monitoring how Amari Campbell is going to react to a new defensive coordinator situation, Tony Rojas would have his 4th different defensive coordinator in 4 years at Penn State. And oh, by the way, he's a guy who has a lot of interest brewing on different campuses. And there's some money that could be thrown his way that can make those opportunities very tempting. So curious to see where the wherewithal is with Penn State and ensuring that he can be a piece of the plan next year. Curious to see if there's any air to clear between him and Matt Campbell because of kind of the vocal way that he expressed wanting to see Terry Smith as the coach. And this is a case, just like with a lot of these guys, where Terry Smith coming into the room with the right message about why he's buying into Matt Campbell, why he's staying at Penn State as a non-head coach. What kind of weight does that carry with a guy like Tony Rojas and other players who are considering whether they want to stick around for this new era of Penn State football? I think he's near the top of that list. You mentioned Luke Reynolds when the Andrew Rappleyea thing. I think he's another tight end to keep an eye on. Xavier Gilliam at defensive tackle, who was essentially a starter as a redshirt freshman. Cooper Cousins, another young lineman who we think can take the next step forward. And then Zariah Fisher, as kind of opposite end of the spectrum from Chaz Coleman. He could be a 7th-year guy for you next year. And wouldn't you like to have some veteran presence? Wouldn't you like to have someone who's been through a lot of Big Ten experience? So you could go through a lot of lists here, and we'll do that over at Lions247.com, but just wanted to present some of that here. Let's finish up with the recruiting because all of a sudden, Tyler, it's a subject that our subscribers and hopefully our listeners and viewers are not shying away from. When we bring up recruiting, I think people usually just veered off in a different direction lately. What can you tell us about through 1 week, the bump that Penn State has gotten from Matt Campbell? Who are some of the immediate, obvious names to know? And how is this impacting both the 26 and 27 cycles?
Yeah, people care about me again, so that's nice.
We always did.
Nah, but in all seriousness, you've seen, so I think, a pretty significant level of activity since Campbell and his staff have arrived in State College, and they're still getting settled in. A lot of the recruits that I've talked to understand that, and they understand that it's a waiting game in some aspects. But we've seen several former Iowa State signees get their release from Iowa State reopen their recruitment. They're giving Penn State a long look. So that's something we're charting very, very closely. And then in the 27 class, there's going to be a lot of intrigue in the Midwest about seeing what Campbell can accomplish at Penn State. Obviously, you've got the traditional recruiting footprint here in the Northeast. I think under Campbell, Penn State could expand even more into the Midwest. A guy like Will Slagle, top 24/7 offensive lineman, top-ranked recruit in Iowa, was committed to Iowa State under Campbell's regime. Lifelong Iowa State fan, had family members who played for the Cyclones. Angels looking like home for him up until Campbell's departure for Penn State. And now that not just Campbell, but Ryan Clayton is joining Campbell as Penn State's offensive line coach. He offered Slagle on Thursday night. There's a ton of intrigue. I popped in a crystal ball prediction, the first one in the Matt Campbell era, earlier Friday morning. I think that right now there is going to be enough juice for Penn State to get this one across the line when it comes time for Slagle to make a decision. Staff has been pushing to get him out to campus for a visit. That's going to be something that occurs as soon as the dead period ends, according to Slagle himself. And they've been very straightforward and candid in their messaging to him. They want him to visit, and they want to be part of that 27 class. They want to be a leader in that 27 class. And I think there's a pretty decent chance that happens when it's all said and done.
You got the mute, Tyler.
Yeah.
Chris, I was going to say crystal balls are being popped. I was so excited just to hear that again that I muted myself. But yeah, we are back in business on the recruiting end at Lions247.com. Tyler, you've always been working hard at it. But again, now people are kind of rushing toward your work rather than racing away from it. So I'm glad to see that again. Daniel, anything else to add on top of this episode as we kind of sorted through a bunch of comings and goings on campus, off campus, and that's kind of going to be the way of the world for much of this month of December and January, quite frankly, as Penn State enters a new era of new leadership?
Yeah, I mean, it's 11:43 on Friday, December 12th, and so it hasn't even been a full 7 days since the Campbell news broke last Friday night. I have a page on Lions 247 where I've gathered all of our Campbell related headlines in terms of some coach movement, different things coming out of Campbell's news conference, the recruiting stuff that Tyler has done. And I think I didn't do an exact count. I counted my own stories last night, but I think we got to be up over 40 links on that page from the past week. So we are, churning it out. If you feel like you've missed anything, you can go to that page. I've posted on social media. I think it's on our homepage, and you can do some reading to catch up. And I think over the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a lot more to add to it. So it's been fun. And yeah, I mean, it was the thing where after the hire, I was kind of like, well, like the job's done, but now we've got the real work. And it's been fun doing it alongside you guys.
Yeah, we figured out the new name at the very top of the pyramid, but outside of Terry Smith near the very top of that pyramid, there's a lot to fill out from a personnel standpoint. And we're going to do our best to put those pieces together as Penn State does at Lions247.com. 50% off right now on VIP access with a holiday deal. That 75% deal with the coaching search is done, but 50% not so bad as a way to follow VIP coverage all the way through the 2026 season. Big thanks to Tyler Calvaruso and Daniel Gallen for their perspective, which you can catch all the time over at the website. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.